2 minutes to 0 hour. Okay. Well, I see that we are getting some participants. Excellent. Yes, don't worry, people. We're live here. We're just getting everything prepped and dusted off so that your listener and viewing experience is optimized. And since the screen has changed, I guess we already go. Well, greetings, everyone. I hope everybody has enjoyed their first day of Farpoint. It's been an interesting experience for me, having being only my second virtual conference. But hopefully everybody's bright and bushy-tailed. Hopefully more bushy-tailed than I am right now, but that's the way things are running. I'm Christopher D. Ochs, your host for today in the romp through everything about fairy tales. Everything you know about fairy tales is wrong. And I think you'll enjoy this. I just wanted for you guys to see my face before we go to the slides. I am an author. I have 3 books to my name. My latest is My Friend Jackson, a urban YA fantasy. And although I'll mention it late at the end of this, my website is christopherdocks.com. I use the middle initial D because it separates me from 2 other, believe it or not, Christopher Ochses who have authored books on various subjects. So having that been said, let's go to the presentation. You should be seeing the full screen by now, and I'm counting on Tech Jeff P to tell me if it isn't on everybody's screen. Let's see, let me just double check the chat. Okay, looks like we're good. All right. I just want to give everybody a heads up that this is essentially rated PG-13 because there are some disturbing concepts in here. Believe it or not, most of them from the fairy tales themselves. So just want to get that out there in case we have parental units who are letting their children sit in. There's nothing too dangerous in here, but some children may be upset at some of the topics I discuss. So fair warning, ladies and gentlemen. Now, a little bit about myself. I'm a member of several groups, both writers and others. I'm the president of the Greater Lehigh Valley Writers Group and a member of Bethlehem Writers Group. But most importantly, I am a member of the Lehigh Valley Storytelling Guild, which is a group where we literally get up on stage and tell stories. And it's been not just a good way to get yourself used to speaking in large groups, small groups, and so on. You are practicing the art, and believe me, there is an art to storytelling. And several of the members there who are professional storytellers have a rich um, bowl full of knowledge that I've been drawing from. And one of my books, If I Can't Sleep, You Can't Sleep, was created by that. I would create a story, tell it live, and if I got a good reaction out of it, it became a short story in this collection. Now, when in this group, I was subjected to fairy tales of all sorts, not just the fairy tales that we know and love, but Russian fairy tales, Greek fairy tales, Bulgarian fairy tales, Danish, and Celtic fairy tales, all of which have their own interesting tweaks, but they all seem to have several things in common. And they are several archetypes like Damsel in Distress, which we'll go through a couple of them, not too many of them because we only are here for 55 minutes. I could talk about 3 hours on all this stuff, but we don't have time for that. Once I cover the archetypes, then we'll be looking at their origins and their evolution because they have changed over the centuries. And finally, we'll compare them against actual historical figures and how real life in medieval times, which is where most of the fairy tales come from, how closely or not too closely true medieval figures of note stack up against their fairy tale counterparts. So the ones I'll be concentrating on are the damsel in distress and the knight in shining armor. Now, there are several other ones that we can take a look at. However, due to limited time, I may make some comments about the evil stepmother, but that's a half-hour talk all by itself. Psychology runs rampant through that particular topic. So where did they originally come from? Well, we all know that the Grimms, Brother Grimm, collected them from oral traditions, and not just from families and from old grandmothers who were passing down information from generation to generation, but they also visited taverns and other public gathering places to collect their stories. So some of them were very prim and pristine, and others were kind of earthy, if you take my meaning. And they recorded them all. However, over time, beginning with the Brothers Grimm, something happened called the Gothic Revival, and that was a romancing of what medievalism actually was. There was a conception of what medieval era looked like. It started, historians will say the medieval era is between the 5th and 15th centuries, a full 1,000 years. However, the Gothic Revival tended to take a snapshot of one era and pretend that represented the entire 1,000 years. And once this idea of the Gothic Revival took hold, it spread through Europe, the colonies, and everything, going to America, to Australia, and so on. It came to full flower during Queen Victoria, who came to power in 1837, which is around the time that the Brothers Grimm were creating their 7, some historians say 8, versions of their fairy tales. Although I have not seen this officially documented, I can't help but to wonder if nostalgia was the biggest drive in how the Gothic Revival influenced the view of what really was happening in medieval times. Consider the current day. We have a nostalgia for the old times, like how simpler things were back in the 1950s, 60s, and so on. It's a romanticization. Things were complicated back then, but we romanticize saying things were simpler back then. And right around the Queen Victoria age, just after the Brothers Grimm, we had science and industrialism starting to make things interesting. Maxwell and Faraday were cracking the code on this mysterious force called electricity and magnetism. Fulton was beginning to replace the horse and buggy with steam engines, and Morse, with the telegraph, was able to send messages far beyond. And although that Morse happened much later, you get the idea that industry was beginning to take hold in Victorian England, and my theory is that people had a overarching drive for nostalgia, and that helped refine what the Gothic Revival turned medievalism into. One of the first places we see this Gothic Revival polluting the concept of what medieval times really looked like was in architecture. And we first go, well, there are several examples. The best example that I've been able to find is Castle Koch, which is a couple of miles outside of Cardiff in Great Britain. Now, Castle Koch was built around the 1000s, right after the Norman Conquest, to make sure that such a thing never happened again. However, after 800 years of neglect, only 2 rooms survived, a chapel and something larger than a closet. However, the property was bought by a rich magnate in shipping by the name of John Crichton Stuart, and he rebuilt it with the help of one of the premier architects of that time, a William Burgess. But is the castle they built representative of what medieval times really looked like? No. As a matter of fact, a biographer, Mr. Crook, a biographer of the architect Burgess, says that this castle is basically just totally made up. Castles in those days were much squatter, much wider, and this is basically just the product of the imagination of Mr. Crichton Stuart and Mr. Burgess. But because it was something solid, something people could see, it caught on, and it polluted the concept and of what medievalism was and what castles looked like. And another symptom of the Gothic Revival we start seeing in fairy tales. Now, fairy tales are a bit closer to the original roots, but they too had a symptom of things changing. And one of the best examples I've been able to find is Red Riding Hood. Everybody's familiar with Red Riding Hood. However, about 150 years before the Brothers Grimm, there was a documentarian by the name of Charles Perrault. And in his original version of Red Riding Hood meets the wolf devours Red Riding Hood, the end. Nobody gets rescued, nobody comes along and helps Red Riding Hood. This essentially was the 1500s, the 1600s version of a tale to Don't Talk to Strangers. It was only until the Brother Grimm came along that we started seeing this tale evolve. And it didn't just change once, it changed several times over several editions. Remember, they have 7 or 8 different editions that were printed over their lifetimes. For example, the character of the huntsman is introduced, and that is the mechanism by which Red Riding Hood and her grandmother are rescued. The wolf, depending on which version you read, dies in 3 different ways. The wolf is either just shot by the huntsman, it's gutted by the huntsman, and therefore Red Riding Hood and the grandmother are rescued as they jump out alive. And they put stones in the gut of the wolf and drown it in a trough, or they fill his stomach with burning coals and he dies from his wounds that way. So the story changes from edition to edition. Which one is the most accurate? It's a Gordian knot that we leave it to the reader and readers to unravel, because historians just don't know sometimes. Other examples of fairy tales and how they changed over the eons. 3 examples that I often point to: the juniper tree, Thousand Furs, and the goose girl, because they are examples of cannibalism. The juniper tree is very much like one of those Shakespearean plays where the stepmother feeds the children to the husband in a pie. In Thousand Furs, the princess runs away from the king because the king wants to wed his daughter. Incest. And the goose girl is one of the most colorful, and I say that with a smile, colorful modes of torture where a evil milkmaid takes the place of the princess, and once her lie has been found out, she's stripped naked, thrown into a barrel lined with nails, and the barrel is rolled down a hill, and she is summarily drowned in the river at the bottom of the hill. What a way to go. Now, these types of tales you are never going to see on Disney, and for obvious reasons. If they ever do show up, they're going to be intensely Baudelarized and sanitized for your protection. But these are the types of things that will constantly crop up in the raw fairy tales. And as I mentioned during Red Riding Hood, they change over editions. Sexual aberrations are toned down. For example, there's a story called The Girl Without Hands, where rather than sexual violence, she loses her hands. Christianity and monarchy also are things that change in these stories. They get introduced and then they get removed and they get introduced again. So, quite a few times you'll see fairy tales where in one version of the tale, a princess has to choose between 12 doors. Later on, you'll see a version of the same story where she has to choose between 12 angels. These facets and other elements come in and out of the stories depending on who tells it, and when it's told. But the most gruesome fairy tale that I've ever seen come out of the Grimm brothers is How the Children Learned to Butcher. The story is what it tells you. And the original story was just 3 children go in, 2 children, and a plate of sausage come out. I have no idea what the lesson to be learned in that story was, but apparently they found it worthy to be preserved. In the first version of the story, that's all that happens. The children get away with it. Actually, we don't even find out if there's any repercussions. In later versions, they try to inject some morality into it. The family self-destructs. Mother kills herself when she discovers what the children did, and father comes home, sees the destruction, and he just pines away until he dies of sadness. In the final version, or the latest version, the children are tried by the city fathers and found not guilty because they were just playing around. Thank goodness, though, in most versions of the Grimm's fairy tales, they're excised together. In modern compilations of the complete Grimm's fairy tales, you can still find this story, and at least one edition I'm aware of has 2 of these versions of this story. Another symptom of how Gothic Revival changed things is this symptom. Why did they change? And we kind of touched on that with monarchy and religion polluting the original intent of the story. But it's easy to blame things like editors. I, as a writer, sometimes have contentious meetings with editors, agents, publishers, and so on, because they want to make changes. Mostly because what they have to make changes for what the market will bear. The exact same forces faced the Brothers Grimm. They had to change some of the stories to adjust to their audience, because remember, during that time, books were not the easily available things they are today. They were available on a very limited basis because printing was far more difficult than it is today, also far more expensive, and their audience were usually the upper crust, the people who could afford to buy books. So they had to adjust their tales to appeal to those tastes so that they could sell the books and make money and eat. So as a result, we start to see things like bourgeois leanings, like favorable towards the rich, go in. And depending on political and religious feelings of the day, sometimes the king is good, sometimes the king becomes bad. Tales where the king is good become more popular, and later on, tales where the king is an evil SOB become more popular. Catholicism sometimes goes in, and unfortunately, sometimes anti-Semitic stuff filter into some of these tales. But so it's politics and economics are usually the reasons why these things change. Now, a symptom where we can really see how things get polluted are in the finer arts, not just in printed books, but in the arts that are presented to the vox populi. Because even though opera was for the upper crust. The music did filter down into the bars and taverns eventually, and people were told about these stories. Unfortunately, they were looking through a glass darkly. They weren't getting the original fairy tale. They were getting the fairy tale as told by Rossini, Tchaikovsky. Humperdinck is an especially good example because not only did he add his own spin to the tale of Hansel and Gretel, he got the idea for this opera based on a puppet show at his niece's birthday party. So think of this. If you've ever played the game of telephone, we are now seeing an opera based on what started with the original fairy tale, hopefully, and the puppeteer's interpretation of that, and then Humperdinck's interpretation of the puppet show. So as you can see, things can get lost, invented, or added. One of my favorite things, and I'm sure this audience is probably aware, things like the horns in the helmet that we see so often in the Teutonic operas, like the Nibelungenring by Wagner. That never happened. It was just an artistic costume design decision. Let's put the horns on the helmet. Sure, Vikings always did that. No, they didn't. No Viking ever wore a horn on their helmet. Since I have this display up, by the way, I am not seeing the chat or the QA. I saw there was one thing on chat. If somebody has questions, I might see it. Yes, I believe I see it. So I'll try to keep an eye out for that. But if I miss it, I'm hoping that my tech person will say, "Wake up, Chris." Anyway, on with the show. Now, where did the actual notions, these polluting ideas of medieval life actually originate? Well, or how did they originate, and how did they pollute the fairy tale? We know where the sources came from. How did they get into these fairy tales? Well, one has to look at the nature of the fairy tale. It is, of course, starts out as an oral tradition, just like the Torah. It is handed down from generation to generation by mouth. Usually, it's preserved very well, just like Homeric poems were told faithfully from city to city, with occasional details of various cities brought in so that it can appeal to the local audience. But overall, it remained solid from generation to generation. But fairy tales have an intentional lack of detail. For example, we often see a story start with, "There once was a beautiful princess," or "There once was a handsome prince." That's all we know about them. We are never told if they were tall, short, thin, fat, muscular, deep-voiced, what colored hair they had. We are not given any of their details unless it impinges upon the story. For example, we are told Rapunzel has long hair because it's necessary for the story, and that is the only time we're ever given details in the story. When we read modern fiction, we often go into the head of the character. What's their motivation? Why did they do this? Not so in a fairy tale. They just go and do it. No reason why, they just go and do it. That vacuum tends to get filled up very quickly by poetic license, inaccurate histories, and social tastes, like we had discussed before. Religion, politics, economics, and unfortunately, discrimination. But you can imagine this very similar to what we see in social media or the old game of telephone. The story gets retold and retold, and sometimes people do not intend to preserve the original source, and they start adding their own stuff. And as a result, it's a slow motion Facebook or slow motion social media. The story gets distorted, and it becomes a real Gordian knot of a problem to figure out what really came first. Like, did this affect the fine arts, or did the fine arts affect that? And to this day, it's a wild topic of discussion for historians in investigating fairy tales. So now that we know that these fairy tales are probably nothing like what they originally were, let's take a look at how the existing fairy tales compare against their actual romantic archetypes. And the first one is the damsel in distress. What's our typical damsel in distress like? It's almost always of noble birth, powerless against a superior force, a wizard, the wicked witch, the stepmother. It's held in a remote location, and she's just sitting there docile, twiddling her thumbs, awaiting rescue. And she's chaste. She has to be a virgin, never touched by a man. Well, let's see. Does that hold up? Joan of Arc obviously is the first person to smash that sacred cow. Since she's well known to most of our audience and people in general, I'm not going to go into great detail. That's the summary of what she has done, and she died burned at the stake. But again, this is a story that we're all familiar with, but we tend to dismiss it because, oh, well, that's Joan of Arc. She's the exception to the rule. Not really. Let's take a look at another person, Matilda of the House Canossa. Now, I have two pictures of her up here. The one on your left, pardon my dyslexia, the one on your left is a historic painting of Matilda, and probably closer to what she looks like. On the right, we see a photograph of a historical reenactor. So you can see right here in our modern day life, people take incredible poetic license when it comes to representing their characters. Now, a future historian may take a look at this and say, you know, like, oh, the lady in gray is what Matilda looked like. No, not at all. But that's exactly the type of pollution that occurs in these historical figures. But let's take a look at Matilda. Was she a shrinking violet? Not in the slightest. Her personal history: her father was slain by a poison arrow, and she became a ward of Godfrey the Bearded. Godfrey wanted to preserve his power, so he married her off to his son, Godfrey the Hunchback. And from that name, we can probably guess that he wasn't too handsome a person. He died of mysterious causes, as did several other of Matilda's husbands. And through the years, through blood relations and her marriages, she accrued land, power, and military might. But what did she do with it? Well, she knew how to do it because her father, before he was slain, made sure that she was tutored in the military arts. And records show that she was just an astute warrior as on horseback as she was on foot. So she lived in a time where Italy did not yet exist. It was a mishmash collection of feuding provinces, and she held on to her province with an iron fist. And she was not necessarily a kingmaker, but she was a pope maker, which culminated in a very interesting story that just makes me chuckle every time I think about it, where she defeated the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, and made him swear fealty to her and the Pope, barefoot in the snow in the front before her gates. What a picture that must have been. So, is she a damsel in distress? Yes. Was she the fainting violet that we see in fairy tales? No. And I could give you several other examples, and I will. Nicola de Lehigh from England. She was the Castellan of Lincoln Castle, Lincolnshire, which is about 20 miles off the eastern coastline of England, just north of London. And as a result, because of its excellent bay conditions, it often was the attack point for various pirates, French armies and navies, and so on. So she was an old hand at fighting off the French. In one instance, however, she did not have all her forces to bear. She was not as well prepared as she usually was. So, despite the fact that she really didn't need rescuing, a knight by the name of William Marshall came along and so-called rescued her. Once he took control of the castle, he gave the castle to his brother, the Earl of Salisbury. Was Nicola de Lehigh going to stand for this? No. She immediately went to London, petitioned the House of Lords, and kicked the Earl of Salisbury out of her castle, and successfully maintained her office as sheriff, a castellan, until her late 70s, when she died peacefully. So this is a woman that was a no-nonsense person, and you did not mess with her. Another favorite of my stories is Marjorie, Countess of Carrick. You probably have not heard of her, but her story is interesting nonetheless, and you'll find out why. During the Eighth Crusade, sad news was brought to her house by a messenger that her husband, the Count Adam of something totally unpronounceable, had been killed in a skirmish. The messenger brought the message in person to the Countess, but did she wail away? No. Did she drown in a pool of tears? No. She kidnapped the messenger and held him in seclusion in her castle for 15 days until, boop, they emerge as married. So this is a damsel in distress who is obviously not in distress, but knows what she wants. Now, again, you probably have not heard of her, but her methods are probably something you've heard about because they were definitely used by her son, Robert the Bruce. And I'm pretty sure people have heard of him. Last on the list that I'm going to be looking at is a French lady, Jeanne de Clisson. She was a person who started out as minor royalty and became a pirate. Her husband was convicted of treason against the French king, beheaded, and the head was displayed on a pike. And the king cruelly forced her and her sons to observe the head on the pike. She did not witness the beheading, but she and her sons were forced to look upon her dead husband, their dead father. She was so upset by this, she sold all the lands, bought a ship and a crew, and became a pirate. And she became a pirate that probably would have given the dread Pirate Roberts pause, if I can mix my metaphors here. She was quite ruthless. Whenever she took a ship, she killed the entire crew, save one, so that there was a person to tell the tale. And she became so feared that the English hired her, gave her a fleet called the Black Fleet, and her flagship she named My Revenge. And she captured 3 French castles with the Black Fleet. She obviously very properly earned the title of the Lioness of Brittany. Obviously, a damsel in distress that you don't want to mess around with. There are countless others. Eleanor of Aquitaine, mother of Richard the Lionhearted. Now remember William Marshall, the knight who rescues maidens who don't want to be rescued? William Marshall was her go-to hatchet man. Christine de Pizan, she was the first feminist author. Before her, ladies who appeared in the finer works of literature were always subservient, were always ladies in waiting, had very minor roles, or if they had a major role, they were always a seductress. She was the first person who wrote literature for the upper crust, where the woman was the protagonist. The woman had, and if they weren't the protagonist, they had a specific part in the plot. Marjorie Kemp is known as the first medieval businesswoman. She was not particularly successful, but some historians say that's because the history was written by all of her male counterparts who tried at every step to make sure that she didn't succeed. But she was a successful milliner, tailor, and her last job was she had a series of women who were professional mourners. But she is recognized as the first medieval businesswoman. These are just a handful of several examples. If you dig, you'll find in history several examples of women taking charge. So let's look at the more accurate description of what the medieval damsel was. Were they in distress? Sure. Everybody was in distress. They were no exception. But the men were often at wars, either in court or in crusades or doing other stuff. But the women were expected to carry their load. Marriages were not for love. They were to maintain the business, the family, and protect from outsiders. And sometimes all these 3 responsibilities conflicted with one another. But the women were expected to deal with it while the men were away and handled it handily. Now, chastity, remember, damsels were expected to be chaste. That was not all that well practiced, as we saw with the Countess Carrick and the mother of Robert the Bruce. There are several other examples I could state, but keep in mind that towards the end of the medieval era came along the Black Plague. Chastity was not really all that well practiced, and it was thrown out the door during and after the Black Plague because 1/3 of Europe was decimated, gone. So there was a drive to repopulate Europe. And as a result, the fact that marriages were cemented just to preserve family units were the order of the day. And I sometimes wonder, this is my own pet theory, that this might be where the evil stepmother originated, because there were so many families that were forced together and no love was lost between the stepmother and the children of the father, nor was there any much love lost between the stepfather and the children of the mother. But why the stepmother became the easier target, I'm not sure. There are examples of evil stepfathers, but more often than not, you'll see either an evil stepmother or a father who has no mother at all. They either died in childbirth or the plague had taken. Now that we've beat up the damsel in distress, let's take a look at the knight in shining armor. Now, what's our mental picture of the knight in shining armor that Disney so often tells us? By the way, that picture is from a movie called Excalibur. I love that film. It is not by any means historically accurate. It's based on the Mort d'Arthur, but it's still a wonderful film. But did they wear armor like that? No. But let's take a look at the knight overall. They're expected to be brave, honorable, trustworthy, everything that a Boy Scout is expected to be, chivalrous. A defender of the law. That's mostly true. Protector of the defenseless? We'll see. Rescuer of damsels in distress. Oh boy, do we have some interesting information on that. And cool armor. Not really. They had armor, but not bright and shiny like that. At least not when they were on the battlefield. So let's take a look and decompose or deconstruct what the medieval knight actually was. But let's take first a look at chivalry and the concept of it. What are its etymological roots? Chivalry is derived from a French word. Cheval is French for horse. Chevalier is a man on a horse. In other words, a knight. Chivalry is the manner of the knight, the behavior of a man on a horse, I guess, is the literal translation of that. But this is where we get the word chivalry, chivalry. How is chivalry defined? Well, the first definition we can find in text is by a poet from France, Christian de Troyes. And he is responsible for many things associated with our current understanding of the legend of Arthur and the Holy Grail. His is the first literary reference of the Holy Grail. And he is the creator of the character Lancelot, or at least the first reference we can find in text of the character Lancelot. He appears in a play that he had written, or a poem he had written, surprisingly entitled Lancelot. Now, in this literary work, Lancelot spends most of his time teaching his lessers, his squires and so on the art of being a knight. However, if you look through this play/poem, you'll find an interesting tidbit, and I'll boil it down to this. As a knight, if you are given charge to protect a damsel as you travel from point A to point B, hands off. If she is sullied in any fashion, it's your responsibility and it's going to be taken out on your skin. However, if you fight a fellow knight and capture said damsel, you can do anything you want with her. You can rape her. You can do anything you want without shame or blame. This is not the definition of chivalry that we tend to think of when we see Disney films, is it? Unfortunately, this may be an accurate portrayal of what knights truly were and what they were allowed to do. Well, let's see if we can find anything to corroborate that. Well, yes, we have another source, a Raymond Lull is his name, and he was a missionary from France who escorted and served several knights in at least two of the Crusades. And he was appalled at the behavior that he had seen at some of the so-called knights down there. Knights were often promoted in rank, and the people from which they were promoted from were the scum of the earth. Let's put it very succinctly. Raymond was disgusted by what he had seen, and he began to write the rules of chivalry. If you've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, we now know where the word silly English Knigget came from, because Raymond Lull wrote the Book of the Order of Knigitude. I found that humorous. I hope you do too. But in this book, he describes how the knight should behave. He describes the code of chivalry. He spends most of the book talking about the treatment of equals. And by the way, you can find this book in several places, including Project Gutenberg. And if you try reading this, it is written in Old English that would make Chaucer choke. It is very difficult to get through, but most of the book deals with the treatments of equals, other knights, and duties to your betters, your dukes, your lords and ladies, and so on. 3 out of the 8 chapters are spent on the behavior of squires, but there's very little, maybe 2 sentences, about protection of the weaker, protection of widows and orphans, and almost nothing about protection of the other weaker people, that is, men. And an interesting point, it sanctions the practice of ransom. Ransom is not a word I would normally associate with chivalry, but it was a common practice and it was accepted. And we'll see several examples of how it was a part of their life in a few of the people we'll examine. As you might infer, chivalry was extended only to other knights. The weaker people were not really protected. Oh, I'm sorry. And even then, it wasn't too rigidly enforced, mostly because knights were human beings. They were not as chaste and as Boy Scoutish as we would wish them to be. The peasants were mostly ignored. And depending if they were on the winning or losing side, they were persecuted, and persecuted quite brutally. So let's take a look of some historical examples of how chivalry was really practiced. I have about 15 minutes left. The Battle of Preschi. This was an infamous battle between the English and the French. The English were outnumbered 3-1. However, to their credit, the French were trying with all their heart to practice the art of chivalry, as defined by Raymond Lull. They came in, march with their horses in order, in orderly ranks. Unfortunately, the English did the not so chivalrous thing, and with their archers killed the horses and the French knights in a valley, most of them. It's kind of ironic that chivalry was not extended to the horses from which the word stems from. After this battle was won by the English, France became overrun by free companies, English mercenaries and French commoners. They took the place of the viscounts, the dukes, and all the lesser royalty and powers that be. They filled the vacuum that was left behind by the people killed in battle. Now, once King Edward, at the time, I believe it was King Edward, started to hear about the troublemakers growing in France, replacing the troublemakers that were originally there, the French dukes, he was faced with a problem what to do with them. He said, okay, all you English people, come back to England. And the commoners, the mercenaries, the criminals said, we like it here, thank you very much. We do not want to come back to England because it's better here in France. It's better to live as a French king rather than a English commoner. Well, Edward had a bit of a conundrum there. So he offered them a deal. He created a court of chivalry to rein them in, and he made them the Order of the Garter. So we think of the Order of the Garter as a collection of the finest of nobility, the finest of knights. No, not at all. It was a order to rein in the ruffians, the criminals, the not noble. So, interesting is the word I use for that. Another practice of chivalry that was not practiced is Lemoj Revolt. Limoges, famous for its china. Now, in this battle, chivalry was observed to a certain extent. 3 knights had surrendered, and they were ransomed, perfectly legal to do. However, the English soldiers executed everyone else. 3,000 peasants were executed. If you think that's bad, the rape of Cesena was even worse. Now, this occurs a few hundred years after Matilda of Canossa. Remember, this is Italy before it was Italy, where it still was a feuding set of provinces based on family, political power, and religion. There were a couple of times where province versus province went against each other because they had a slightly different definition of what Catholicism should be. And such was the case with the rape of Cesena. A Cardinal Roberto did not like some of the new practices that were sneaking into the city of Cesena. So he hires an English knight, John Hawkwood, one of the more famous knights of his day, and therefore he could easily summon up a quick army to take it down to that province of Italy. Unfortunately, Mr. Hawkwood, being the ruthless knight he was, came in, collected the 4 city fathers, and had them summarily executed. The city went bonkers, and they immediately rioted once the news had spread, and they killed every knight that they could find, lay their hands on. A total of 300. Well, one good riot and one bad deed deserves another. The English, of course, and John Hawkwood could not let that stand, so their retribution was fast and furious. Unfortunately, it is one of the worst examples of chivalry not practiced that I could find. Depending on the historical record you look at, anywhere from 2,500 to 8,000 peasants were executed, and not just the men who had participated in the riots. Women, old and young, sick, children, pregnant women were cut to pieces. Everyone was killed. No one was spared. So much for chivalry. Now that we've totally sullied the image of chivalry, let's take a look at the practice of ransom. Tournaments are what were practiced before jousting became the order of the day. It was very chaotic, and jousting was later on gentrified and rules were imposed. William Marshall, remember the knight who rescues damsels who don't want to be rescued? He became the most prolific, and because he was most prolific, he became the richest of the knights of his day. And of course, we've mentioned that ransom is sanctioned in Raymond Lull's works. But for every good practice, there's someone who abuses it. One of the best abusers, or worst abusers, of the practice of ransom was a gentleman from England by the name of Robert Knowles. He was either a hero or a scurrilous fellow, depending on what you talk to the victors or the losers. He had such a reputation in France that whenever you saw a burned church or chapel, it was called Knowles Mitre, or Knowles Hat. So his name was associated with burned churches. But Mr. Knowles, or Sir Knowles, got his reputation from a rather unique abuse. During one bad battle that turned against him during the Battle of Preschi, which I believe was, no, I'll probably make a mistake if I try to guess here. However, he printed a ransom on his helmet while he ran away. So don't take my head if you capture me, and I'll guarantee that you get money. So he kind of perverted the practice of ransom, or like a brave knight and I use brave in quotes, he used ransom to preserve his scrawny neck. So that was perfectly allowed, but would we consider that chivalrous? Obviously not. So what is the more accurate depiction of the medieval knight? Well, he was a mercenary. He was probably a sociopath because they came up from usually the dregs. They were promoted on the field quite often. And as a result, they were not schooled. They were not gentrified at all. But they were practiced in what I call the 4 Fs: fighting, fame, and fortune, and fornication when it's available. Remember, if you rescue a damsel from another knight, you can do whatever you want with her, and it's perfectly fine. That is what chivalry is all about, ladies and gentlemen, not the picture that Disney likes to tell us. But where did the shining armor come from? Well, as you can see in the one picture, we have a Greco-Roman cuirass, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And that was one of the last times in early armory that we see full plate armor, but it was made of bronze. So once steel came on the scene, it was pretty useless as armor. In medieval times, ring mail was the most common one. Later on, it became chainmail, but ring mail, which is essentially jumbo-sized rings, was the most common thing and the cheapest thing to armor your army with. Plates did not exist except around joints, usually a small circle of steel around the shoulder or the knee or the hip, because if you got injured in a muscle, like say an arrow in the thigh, you can still function with that. But if you take a sword to the shoulder joint, you're out for the duration. So plates, the glorious plate mail we saw in Excalibur, really did not exist during Arthur's time. Full field steel plates didn't occur until very, very late in medievals. Remember, medieval time is defined as 500 to 1500. Oh, yes, I'm seeing some of the comments. Terry Jones, yes, I saw some of Terry Jones' miniseries. If you haven't seen it, definitely take a look at it. So steel plates didn't exist and they until very late, and they were more often than not a defense against advancements in technology. Arrows originally had arrowheads like the ones we picture, where they're triangular. However, as crossbows also came into the fray, the arrowheads became more bullet-like and could easily go right through the holes in ring mail. So plates became larger. Armor became clunkier. But because of the Gothic Revival, we have this thing stuck in our head that knights in shining armor wore shining plate armor, and it just wasn't so. So I've totally wrecked your visions of the damsel in distress and the knight in shining armor, and it's all because of what historians call the Gothic Revival. It distorted what medieval life was like, and unfortunately, it was persistent, and it persists to this day of what we imagine medieval times to be like. We see that the damsel in distress is not always a damsel just sitting on her tuffet waiting to be rescued. And the knight is sometimes, more often than not the person you want to be rescued by. So, all that being said, I am a writer of fantasy. My first novel, Pinelbrith of Lenland, is not per se about knights in shining armor, but it is fantasy. I describe all the characters are animals. I describe it as Narnia meets the Da Vinci Code, the Bourne Conspiracy, and maybe a little bit of Harry Potter. Swords and sorcery, puzzles, and all sorts of things. If I Can't Sleep, You Can't Sleep is a collection of short stories. If you're into fables and short stories, that's a collection of my Twilight Zone twisted fairy tales. My latest novel is My Friend Jackson, and true to form, I bring in a monster to help a girl who is severely bullied, and the monster comes from African tribal lore. Again, I love mythologies. When I was a kid, I just ate everything I could in Greek mythology. So that's about it. And I'm under the wire. How about that? 3 minutes to go. I don't see any questions. Let me take a look at the chat line. I hope everybody has enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions after this, I'll be on Gathertown for a couple of minutes until I go off to another panel. But look for me there if you have things you want to talk about. Other than that, I think we're done. Let me just take one last check. All my books are available on Amazon, so go to my webpage, Christopher D. Ochs, and remember the middle initial because the D is always there so that you don't get other Christopher Ochses. There's a Christopher Ochs who writes about deep sea fishing in Montana. Go figure. But if you like the Twilight Zone, stories of the weird, and a little bit of horror thrown in, I think you'll enjoy my books. So I thank you for your time. I hope you had a laugh or two and learned a couple of things. I certainly learned a ton of things researching this stuff, and I'm glad I did. So enjoy the rest of the convention, everybody, and I shall see you later. How'd that go?
Very well. We do still have audio live until this was still there. So however many people still remaining are here in this chat. 7 people remaining as they file out into Gathertown or to Discord.
Well, I really haven't played around with Discord yet, so I won't be there immediately, but as soon as I log off here, I will be in Gathertown.
Discord is a modernized Mutter Mush, if that helps you. Think about it, and that's what it is.
Well, I played around in Gathertown last night, and I liked it a lot. Got to speak to a bunch of other panelists and so on. So I thought it was an interesting concept. I like it. I approve.
Okay, and I'm going to end the meeting now. Have a good day.
Thank you again, Jeff, and have a good weekend.